2021 is coming to a close, so it's time to review every single new roguelike and roguelite that I played this year. I'll review both the greats and the bads in 1 minute each, so you can decide which games are worth your time. These games are all new to me, though a few might have come out before 2021. For the sake of not repeating myself, I won't talk about games I reviewed in last year's video, and I won't talk about games from my obscure roguelites video. We have 30 games to talk about, so let's get into it. Curse of the Dead Gods is a top-down, Souls-like roguelite that has a punishing but rewarding combat. The game has a lot of different combat mechanics to learn and master, such as stamina management, and the core gameplay revolves around learning enemy and boss attacks and movesets, especially how to time your dodges and parries. The game is full of great risk-reward mechanics, both within each fight, deciding whether to play aggressive or play it safe, and between fights as well, with managing your corruption level or getting extra curses in favor of rewards. There are also a good amount of unlocks, both in terms of new weapons or perks to use, and also in terms of difficulty levels or challenges, though the game has a mild amount of vertical progression that is required, or at least expected, if you want to make it far. Overall, I loved Curse of the Dead Gods, and it's one of my new favorite roguelites. It's a game that really rewards learning and mastery, and it has a better learning curve than other Souls-style games that I've played. The core combat and gameplay is just really good. However, I do think the game suffers a bit in terms of enemy and weapon variety. Next up, let's talk about Ring of Pain, which is a dungeon crawler reverse card game roguelite that feels very unique, and in my opinion, it's underrated. You go through levels that have enemy, chest, and item cards in a ring, hence Ring of Pain, and you attack enemies when needed, collect items to make yourself more powerful, and find the exit to go on to the next level. Ring of Pain is one of those games that, when I first started playing, I didn't really have a strategy of how best to win because of how novel the game was, and I really enjoyed that about it. It also has a lot of risk-reward choices you can make throughout the game, and it's just fun to play through. It's definitely a punishing game though, and you'll die a lot when you first learn what to do. However, it has a little less progression and replayability than some other roguelites out there. It has decent replayability, but not amazing replayability. And while I think the game is overall good with its variety and randomness, it has a weird RNG curve where you'll die a lot early on in the runs, but if you get past that start, the RNG is much fairer. Overall, I think this game deserves more attention than it's gotten, and I recommend it for anyone looking for a more unique, turn-based, card game roguelite. However, it might not be for you if you're the type of person that wants to put 200 hours into every roguelite that you buy. The next game is an ARPG roguelite that draws inspiration from Left 4 Dead. Darksburg has fun core gameplay where you fight through hordes of zombies and mini-bosses to reach the final boss. Each of the 5 heroes have several unique basic abilities and a more powerful ultimate ability on a longer cooldown. Some people have compared Darksburg to MOBA games because the controls and abilities feel similar to games like League. However, I also found the controls to be a little clunky, and when you play with the controller, you lose a lot in terms of aiming your abilities. It's also a multiplayer focused game, so even when you play alone, you have to play with at least one other AI character, but if you choose to, you can play with up to 3 friends online or 3 other AI companions. While the core gameplay is fun, the game really suffers from a lack of replayability. It just lacks enemy variety, character variety, map variety. Because of that, it can be a fun game to play in short bursts, but it's just not a game that'll be one of your most top played roguelites. The game has potential, so I would love to see more updates in the future to address that lack of replayability, but unfortunately, it seems likely to stay in this incomplete state forever. Next, Urban Cards is a card game roguelite that feels similar to tabletop card games or multiplayer games like Hearthstone. Your goal is to reach a certain cash threshold before your enemy, and you place cards in different slots in order to gain cash or lower your enemy's cash gain. Because it feels more like a multiplayer card game, and it actually does have a separate multiplayer game mode, it feels different than a lot of other deck builder roguelites that I played, and I like that. I enjoyed that about the game. It also has a good amount of variety of cards and playstyles with different ways that cards synergize and different types of cards that you can focus on. And you can play as 4 unique factions with their own decks that focus on different types of synergies in the game. And a lot of the fun in the game for me came from trying to beat the game with all these different factions and their alternative starting decks. However, Urban Cards is lacking in any form of difficulty levels to climb, like you would have in Slay the Spire or Monster Train. There are no Ascension levels or Covenant levels to climb. And because of that, once you can clear the game consistently, there isn't really much challenge left besides beating it with different decks or chasing a higher spot on the leaderboards. So the game could really use some more replayability there. Still, it's worth looking into if you're a fan of card game roguelites, because the game is a little different than other card game roguelites and is enjoyable as a whole. Loop Hero is probably the most unique roguelite that I played this year. This game is an amalgamation of many different games, and it has deck builder, auto battler, RPG, and tile management elements wrapped in a retro art style. In each run, your hero will automatically travel around a loop and fight enemies on their own. Your goal is to place your cards on tiles, and these tiles will spawn enemies for your hero to fight. You want the fights to be hard enough that your hero can level up and get enough good loot to fight the final boss, but not so hard that you lose your run. Loop Hero also has a rich world of lore, and it's one of the few roguelites that fully incorporates the roguelite mechanics into its storytelling. And I really enjoyed the narrative aspects of the game because of that. But Loop Hero is certainly not a game for everyone for a couple of reasons. One, the game has some grinding, and you kind of have to go on farming runs in order to level up your town and get more powerful for future levels. I think this fits the game fine actually, but it certainly does take away from the more pure roguelite experience. Second, runs in this game can have slow periods, where you've done the actions that you can, and you just have to wait for the fights to happen. There are moments where you just need to let the game play by itself for 15 minutes before you can do your next action, and that's obviously not super engaging. Overall, Loop Hero stands out for me for its uniqueness, fun exploration of combos, and the world and narrative, but it's not a roguelite that I'd recommend to every single roguelite fan. Up next, Rogue Star Rescue is a bullet hell and tower defense hybrid roguelite that has a gungeon-like feel to it. You fight through a series of rooms, clearing out enemies before continuing. And when you get to the boss room, you obviously have the boss fight, and you complete an event where you place towers to stop waves of enemies and the final boss from destroying some objective. That boss fight is, of course, the tower defense element, but they did also add a more pure tower defense game mode post-launch. Within each run, you collect guns and items that can have cool synergies like bouncing bullets or exploding bullets. More items are unlocked across runs as you level up your heroes, which also gives your hero more permanent buffs, though they are not super strong individually. You can also upgrade your towers and traps to give them more unique and fun effects within each run. The game also has both local and online co-op, which is pretty rare for a roguelite in my experience. Overall, I did enjoy playing through Rogue Star Rescue, but it feels a little shallow compared to some other action roguelites. It does a lot of different things that are cool, but none of these mechanics individually shine in terms of their complexity. For example, the tower defense elements, one of the differentiating factors of the game, feels like a tacked on element at times, as opposed to one that's central to the core of the game. The game is still fun, it just lacks true depth for any particular gameplay element. Astronarch is a roguelite auto-battler, and it's the most pure auto-battler roguelite that I've seen. It's easy to understand, but it has a surprising amount of depth to the game. You create a party of heroes, starting with 3, ending with 5, and you fight through enemies, mini-bosses, and random events. Really, you actually let the heroes fight, because it's an auto-battler, but you do control their placement, which determines attack orders. You can actually use potions during a fight for occasional buffs or other effects. The more passive and hands-off quality of the fights never bothered me, because the fights themselves are so quick, and the runs as a whole have good pacing. The real strategy and depth in the game comes from the 20+ heroes with their different active and passive abilities, and how you load them up with different items in each run to create cool and hopefully effective combos. You also have to consider your whole team's composition and how to synergize the heroes with each other. The game's weakest area is probably its progression replayability. You have to do certain challenges to unlock certain heroes or items, and there are optional cosmetic auras for heroes as well. Outside of that, most of the replayability in the game comes from the difficulty level system, where you face increasing challenges for 20 levels or so, or just trying out different hero combos. However, I wish this game had a little more variety in terms of actually good items, and a little more enemy variety to go along with that as well. That being said, I think this game is actually overlooked, and if you're looking for a fun, strategy-focused roguelite, I would look more into Astronarch. Now let's talk about Trials of Fire, which is a party-based RPG card game hybrid with a turn-based hex grid gameplay. Each of your 3 characters has their own deck and cards, and you equip each of your heroes with items between fights, and these items give your heroes various modifiers and add new cards to their deck. The gameplay itself looks visually like a tabletop game, and you use your character's cards to move them around, have them attack, or perform other actions. This game has some nice lore and world building as well, and it has different game modes that flesh out that lore in different areas. The game has a large overworld to explore in most game modes, with randomized events you can complete if you want to. The biggest positives of the game for me are that I quite liked how the core gameplay worked, and that strategy that came from that system was really enjoyable to play around with. I also like thinking about how to craft a whole party that synergizes with each other while making each individual character's deck still viable. Collectively, this core combat really carries the game for me. However, this game also has some flaws that limited my replayability. For one, while there are 9 classes, because of how the item system works, different classes share cards, which made them all feel very similar to me after some time. Second, I found it harder than I would have liked to create a successful build, and that's an important element of strategy roguelites like this game. And finally, I found the runs themselves to have slow pacing sometimes, so it felt like the runs kind of dragged on. Overall, Trials of Fire has great combat, and it's a good game, but it just didn't have that same staying power that I was hoping for. Next up, we'll talk about Undermine. This game is a top-down roguelite where you clear rooms on each level, progress down the dungeon or mine, and defeat bosses along the way. You have a pickaxe that you use for both melee and range attacks, as well as bombs to fight enemies. It's a very vertical progression heavy roguelite, where there's a lot of focus on unlocking upgrades run to run, as well as climbing difficulty levels. There are also certain game mechanics such as being able to skip earlier areas and only beating each boss a single time per difficulty levels that make it really a cross-run journey as opposed to more standalone singular runs. There is a more traditional roguelike game mode in the game, but in order to actually get that, you have to complete most of the progression in the game, which makes it not super accessible if you don't want to do that progression in the first place. I think the combat in Undermine is fun and satisfying, and I thought the pacing of the unlocks themselves was actually fine. Despite being a progression-heavy game, it rarely felt grindy to me. Still, the focus on cross-run progression might turn some people away. Also, I do think the game suffers in terms of not having enough variety, especially with how the items interact with your moveset. While there are some items that affect your moveset, these are pretty minor changes, and your combat abilities don't really change much run to run. It's always a similar melee slash, and it's always a similar pickaxe throw. Because of that, I didn't play as long as I would have otherwise, though I have heard they're working on this variety aspect as we speak. Still, if you want a fun action roguelite with satisfying cross-run progression, Undermine is a good choice for you. Children of Morta is an ARPG roguelite that focuses on the story of a family fighting against corruption invading their world. You play as one of 7 characters who are members of the Bergson family, each of whom have their own abilities and movesets. The game has a Diablo-like feel to it at times, where you fight through hordes of enemies coming at you. I enjoyed the combat for the first 10 or 15 hours that I played the game, but it starts to feel awkward and clunky over time due to animation locks and the inability to use melee characters successfully. Children of Morta is a more story-driven roguelite than most, and there are numerous in-game cutscenes with narration throughout your playtime. Along with that story comes heavy vertical progression in the form of buffs for all of your characters, as well as character-specific traits and skill trees. The runs themselves also take on a more level-like approach where you go on runs to clear certain areas as opposed to more general roguelite run. Notably, this game does have local co-op if you're looking for that. It is worth noting that there is also a second game mode with a more traditional roguelite structure without that story, without that heavy progression. And this game mode is fun, and it gave me some more hours in the game, but it definitely feels secondary to the main game mode. It's definitely tacked on. Overall, Children of Morta can be worth checking out if you want that progression and story focus, but it is hindered by that combat jank. Roguebook is a card game roguelite that has a core gameplay similar to Slay the Spire. In this game, you manage a party of 2 heroes, each of whom have their own decks, and you fight the enemies in a turn-based fashion. There is micromanaging of each hero's positions within each fight, and there is strategy with how to synergize cards across the 2 characters, as well as which relics or upgrades you want to give to each character. The overworld of Roguebook sets it apart from other card game roguelites, and it has a nice exploration and optimization aspect there, where you uncover this hex grid world with limited resources, such as brushes or ink. The game does have some vertical progression in terms of upgrades, but it's pretty easy to get the important ones. It also has a unique form of difficulty levels to climb with customization, similar to the structure you see in Hades, and that allows for more strategy and planning. For example, you choose what challenges you'll face for a given run, and you can choose heroes and builds that better face that challenge. Overall, I think Roguebook is a good game for card game roguelite fans. It adds a few new twists to the genre, and I especially liked that customizable difficulty. But the game feels almost too similar to Slay the Spire in terms of the combat itself, and I wish the characters had truly more unique gameplay mechanics. It's a great execution of a deck builder roguelite, but it doesn't innovate as much as I had hoped. Jupiter Hell is a game that tries to combine classic roguelikes with a more modern action-focused roguelite. The game is a Doom-like theme and turn-based gameplay, but it can play more quickly, especially with certain builds. I actually really enjoyed Jupiter Hell when I first started playing it. It felt more accessible than some classic roguelikes, and it was just fun to play through. However, after taking a break with the game, I could never really get back into it. The game only had 3 classes, and while each class has a decent sized skill tree with subclasses, it felt like only a fraction of that skill tree was actually viable. Because of that, the build crafting felt severely limited to me. Additionally, the game is really punishing, so you will often die from small mistakes, especially if you try to play the game more quickly. It also felt like all of the good weapon and build variety came at the end of each run, so the beginning of each run felt really dull, and I didn't really want to start a new run after dying because that early game started to feel like a drag. I do think this game has some good gameplay elements, and the times when I had successful runs were really enjoyable. Because of that, it might be a good roguelite to check out if you're actually good at those classic rogues. But I don't think this game succeeds at being more accessible than other traditional roguelikes, and I don't think it succeeds as a more action-focused roguelike either. Now let's talk about Beat Blast, which is a unique music roguelite. It's not a rhythm game, but it uses a looping beat to create your own attack pattern and music simultaneously. You use this attack pattern to fight through a minimalist, bullet hell, shoot 'em up game. Beat Blast stands out for its unique quality of generating music as you play it, and this music takes on lo-fi hip-hop-like quality. Outside of that, you can create fun builds with different items, power notes, equipment, and more. Some builds can be surprisingly fun and creative, but the game lacks that true build variety compared to some other roguelites. Additionally, the game has cross-run progression through unlocking new items for future runs, as well as unlocking run modifiers that make the run easier or harder depending on which one it is. The game has some decent boss and enemy design, but really, it just needs more gameplay variety. And that's the biggest flaw of Beat Blast. It just needs more enemy types, alternate bosses, those kind of things, in order to keep me playing the game more. So as a whole, the game is decent. It's enjoyable as a fun, relaxing game to play and unwind, but it's just not a content-heavy roguelite. Next, Tainted Grail Conquest is a deck builder RPG hybrid roguelite, and this game separates itself from other card game roguelites with the incorporation of an ultimate ability and passive ability for each of the 9 classes in the game. While there are still within-deck combos, pairing cards with each other, a lot of strategy and synergies in the game come from comboing cards, traits, and runes with that ultimate ability because of how powerful it is. Stacking up that ultimate ability and planning when to use it becomes incredibly important for successful gameplay. Tainted Grail also stands out to me as one of the best card game roguelites to pull off summoners, and the game has a trio of summoner classes that all have different playstyles. I also like the setting and world of Tainted Grail, and it's fleshed out by many side quests, all of which are voice acted. It's one of the better stories that I've seen in a roguelite. The biggest divisive element of Tainted Grail is probably the sheer amount of vertical progression or upgrades in the game. The difference between no unlocks and every unlock in the game is massive, and you get much more powerful over time. That being said, the game does have infinite levels to climb to go along with that progression. Outside of that, the 2 biggest drawbacks for me personally are that you occasionally have runs ended because of a single bad turn, which is frustrating, and the mid-game in some runs can feel a little sluggish. Still, I'd absolutely recommend this game to people because that unique fusion of RPG and card game elements is very successful. Up next is Into the Pit. This game is a retro FPS roguelite that looks like an old school Doom game at times and plays a lot like Ziggurat. You equip magical projectiles in each hand, and you fight through rooms in an arena shooter-like fashion. The core gameplay of Into the Pit is fast-paced and fun, and I enjoyed most of my time with the game because of that. It feels like a game where you can just run straight at enemies and blast away at them. I also like the art style of the enemies themselves, but Into the Pit falls short in many other aspects. The game lacks meaningful enemy variety, build variety, and boss variety. Really, just all forms of variety are lacking in this game. It has some cool ideas like hybrid areas, but none of them are actually realized in a way that stands out to me. The game is also somewhat janky and buggy, though I've seen a lot of bugs fixed since it first released. As a whole, Into the Pit can be a fun game to play through for a short period of time, but it gets repetitive a lot quicker than a lot of other roguelites. Because of that, you'll probably only get limited playtime out of it. Skul, the Hero Slayer, is a 2D platformer roguelite where you play as a little skeleton, fighting against the humans and their heroes. In each run, you can have 2 skulls equipped at a time, and each skull gives you your entire moveset, both attacks and abilities. There's a lot of variety in terms of the skulls that exist, as well as how they play. You can also upgrade these skulls within each run for additional buffs and effects. Along with the skulls themselves, you also collect traits and an active ability on a long cooldown that flush out your build. Before playing Skul, I heard a lot of people compare it to Dead Cells, but I don't think they're that similar. Skul focuses more on clearing rooms, and the combat in Skul has a lot more animation lock, so it feels less fluid than games like Dead Cells. Also, Skul has a good amount of vertical progression, so if you unlock power-ups, run to run as well. I think Skul is a good game as a whole, and I always have fun when I play it. However, I do have some complaints. My biggest is that the most common skulls are kind of boring, while the super fun skulls with unique movesets are more rare, so you don't always get a super fun skull on each run. I'm not that great at Skul also, but expect a full-length review on this game in the future. Next, this more obscure roguelite plays like a turn-based resource management game or a 4X game. And as far as the eye, your goal is to jump through a series of maps to get to the eye or home area. In each map, you manage a team of villagers and you use them to collect resources across this map. And you have to spend certain resources in order to progress to the next area before a flood catches up with you and ends your run. As each villager completes actions, they level up their skills in that area and get better at those actions. There is a branching skill tree to go along with that, where you get various buffs and modifiers once you've unlocked them. I really like certain elements of this game. I like the core mechanics with the exploration, the resource management, and how the villagers leveled up. But this game also made me incredibly frustrated at times because it's super easy in this game to mistime resource management, and then, before you know it, your run is over. For example, you might deplete a food resource tile, and then, before you finish building a new one, you die from starvation. I had so many runs ended one turn away from creating more food, or runs where I didn't collect the necessary resources fast enough, so my game timed out by a turn or two. I think it's still a fun game, and it's definitely a unique roguelite that has a lot of charm. However, the frustration factor of this game is high enough that I kept putting it down in order to take breaks. I'm curious if this will be one of those games that feels much more enjoyable once I get past that initial learning curve. For the King is a turn-based roguelite that tries to emulate the feel of tabletop games. You can play as a variety of classes, and the game has classic RPG elements with how you gear up your character, and you can play co-op with a team of up to 3 characters. The game emulates tabletop games with how every move requires the equivalent of a couple dice rolls. So it's a game with heavy RNG baked into it, which can be frustrating at times. The game has a number of different campaigns and game modes that you can play, some of which are locked behind DLC. I mostly played the first campaign, which has super long runs, taking several hours, so it varies a lot from your typical roguelite in that regard. It also has some cross-run progression, with unlocking new tiles and things to find on future runs. As a whole, this game felt very okay to me. There are some elements that I liked, like the tabletop feel, but as a whole, I felt underwhelmed by the experience. The RNG turned me off, and the RPG build crafting elements didn't really hook me either. It also felt painfully slow in co-op because of how long each turn takes, so it's one of the few games that I played where I strongly preferred playing solo as opposed to with a friend. It might be worth checking out if you want that tabletop feel, but I don't plan to sink any more time into this one myself. If I had to describe Neon Abyss in one sentence, I would say that someone took The Binding of Isaac, made it a 2D platformer, and gave it a different art style. I don't think Neon Abyss has the same depth as Isaac, but it feels very heavily inspired by that game. Basically, in Neon Abyss, your goal is to fight through several floors, filled with many different rooms, and a final boss for each floor. It's a combo-focused, passive stacker game, where your goal is to get strong, or wacky combos, to fight through the enemies. There are also a wide variety of guns in the game that shoot in very distinct patterns. As a whole, the game does well with regard to its item and weapon variety. The game has a good amount of progression as well, and most of that progression is variety focused. For example, unlocking new characters or new rooms to find on each floor. The game also requires you to beat bosses in one run to unlock later bosses in subsequent runs. That means that clearing your first run is actually not the same game as clearing a full run later on, because those later runs have more floors and more bosses. It's a fun game as a whole, but it falls short in a couple areas that limit its replayability. For example, while the game does a great job with things like item variety run to run, it does not do as good of a job with things like room design or enemy variety. It's also an RNG heavy game, in part because of the large item and weapon pool, but also because of other built-in mechanics. I'd recommend this game to someone that wants a passive stacker game that focuses on build variety and wacky synergies. Just don't expect the same replayability as some other roguelike greats. I'll have a longer review on Neon Abyss coming out early next year. Gunfire Reborn is the best FPS roguelite that I have played. It just had its full release last month, and I've been playing it really heavily since then. You fight through 3 or 4 different areas as one of 6 different characters that have their own playstyles, abilities, and passives. The game has a Borderlands-like looting system in it, and the build craft within each run is incredibly enjoyable, with a nice mix of being forced to try new things, while still being able to go a certain playstyle if you want to. The game really shines and feels balanced around co-op, though I personally spent most of my time playing solo and had fun while doing that. The most contentious part of the game for more classic roguelite fans is the vertical progression. There is an extensive cross-run upgrade tree that takes a lot of in-game time to unlock, in addition to unlocking all of the characters. There are increasing challenge levels to go with it, but it's still definitely a game that requires some grind in order to maximize that tree. The pacing of these unlocks is good, but it can have a big impact on co-op if there's an extreme level difference between the 2 players. Outside of that, the combat, of course, has some drawbacks. For example, there's slow movement speed for some characters. But as a whole, I strongly recommend trying out this game if you're interested in FPS roguelites, even a little bit. Now let's talk about some early access games. These games are still in active development by nature of being, early access games, but some of these games have huge potential if they keep on their current path. For the first early access game, let's talk about PokerQuest, which is a new take on the card game roguelite genre. Instead of building a deck of cards, you're given a normal deck of playing cards, and you use those cards in your customizable equipment to get various effects. Some equipment requires certain sets of cards to use, or might just have additional effects if you do use those sets of cards. For example, you might be able to play any card you want in a piece of equipment, but if the two cards you play are a pair, it might deal additional damage. If you've played Dicey Dungeons, it's the same idea, but with cards instead of dice. The overworld of each run reminds me a lot of the branching paths of Slay the Spire as well, and this game has optional cross-run progression. You can choose to clear runs with no upgrades or with upgrades, depending on your preference. I actually love this game. There's a ton of variety with the different classes, different condition effects you can focus on, etc. It does have some drawbacks. For example, some characters and some enemies are super RNG reliant, but I would definitely recommend this game for those that want a novel card game roguelite. Now for Roboquest, which is currently my second favorite FPS roguelite. If Gunfire Reborn is Borderlands in roguelite form, Roboquest is probably closer to Overwatch in roguelite form. The game has 4 different classes with different active abilities on a cooldown, a melee or short range attack, and different possible traits to unlock leveling up your character. You pick up guns that have randomized modifiers and stat types. You can level up these stat types independent of those weapons to increase weapon damage and provide other passive buffs. The build crafting in this game mostly centers around the traits you unlock when leveling up, but the weapons and their modifiers do of course also play a role in your build. The game has some moderate cross-run progression, and it also has co-op if you're looking for that. The biggest positive of Roboquest for me is the core combat is just super fun. It feels fast-paced, it's fluid, and it's super engaging. On the negative side, the game is obviously unfinished, but outside of that, I wish there was a little more build variety, and I wish you weren't locked into a weapon stat so early in each run. Still, this is absolutely a game to keep on your radar if you're into FPS roguelites. Luck Be a Landlord is a surprisingly addicting deck builder slot machine roguelite. Basically, your goal is to fill the slot machine with symbols, and when you roll the machine, the symbols that pop up for each roll can combo with each other and give you gold. You use that gold to pay rent at certain time intervals, and you lose the game if you fail any of these rent checks. There are also items you can collect that modify your rolls in various ways, such as powering up certain symbols or making certain symbols have new effects. Honestly, it's a pretty simple game at its core, but it's quite fun, and I've really enjoyed the variety of combos and synergies. Some combos are just items buffing each other, giving you more gold, while other synergies are more complex, like symbols destroying other symbols to create new ones. It's a game that requires you to focus on these combos if you want to succeed, because if you don't do these combos successfully, you fail the rent checks. The developer has also done a good job of fleshing out this game's mechanics since it first released in early access. They've added new ways to remove symbols from your decks, re-rolling for new symbols, and challenge levels to climb if you're into that. Like I said, it's still a fairly straightforward game at its core, but I've gotten more playtime out of it than I first expected. And it's a great game for listening to podcasts and things like that in the background. Just don't expect to get 100 hours out of this particular game. Despot's game is an auto-battler roguelite in a dystopian setting. The game immediately stands out to me for the care and dedication given to the characters, animations, and overall art design. You set up your team of humans, equipped with various items or weapons, to autonomously fight whatever enemies you encounter in each room. There are also random upgrades or mutations you can find in each run that buff your team, as well as an upgradable within-run skill tree. The only cross-run progression comes in the form of unlocking new teams to start your run with. At the end of each run, the game also has a unique asynchronous PvP game mode where you fight against other players for leaderboards in leagues reminiscent of ranked multiplayer games. Overall, Despot's game is currently in a fun state, but it has some bigger flaws that need some work. For one, the game has a bad learning experience, in my opinion. It can be hard to know exactly what is working well and why it's working well. The game is also incredibly punishing, so the mistakes that you will inevitably make, or just a lack of knowledge about future enemy types, can cause runs to be ended. So I would not recommend the game as it is right now if that bad learning experience would frustrate you. But if that fact doesn't turn you away, this game is a good addition to the roguelite auto-battler genre. Next, Against the Storm is a city builder roguelite where your goal is to recolonize the wilderness one location at a time. The first thing that I need to say about this game is the core gameplay already feels really polished. It has most, if not all, of the shortcuts, editing capabilities, game speed options, etc. that I would expect from a polished city builder, though I don't play a lot of those, so take that with a grain of salt. I like the mechanic of completing quests or objectives to progress the game, the resource and happiness management, as well as the exploration aspect, where the wilderness fights back the more you explore. In short, I think the game already succeeds as a decent city builder. What I'm not sure about so far, because of how much I played, and because it's still in early access, is how well it succeeds as a roguelite specifically. The game does have cross-run progression, and you're building up a civilization of sorts across runs, so it does build on itself run to run, but I'm more unsure about how much variety they managed to add in so that every run doesn't feel the same. It's felt fine to me so far. It has some nice variety elements already. You don't always get the same buildings every run, but we'll see if it manages to achieve that true, great replayability that comes with a good roguelite. One important thing to note is right now, this game is Epic exclusive for early access, but it will be coming to Steam for its full release. Now let's talk about a couple games where I played either an alpha or demo version of them. I'll run through these a little faster because these games are so early in development and subject to change. First, Godless is a game that I played in an unpublished alpha state. I would describe this as a turn-based strategy game where you fight through certain encounters using different modifiable abilities. These abilities include summons and spells, and you try to clear out enemies in each encounter in order to progress. I like this game's core mechanics, and I think it has potential to be a solid mid-tier roguelite, but right now, the game relies too much on vertical progression in order to progress, and I'm not sure yet how deep the mechanics in the game actually are. Also, probably goes without needing to be said for all of these, but the game needs more content. Die After Sunset is a third-person shooter roguelite with an art style that reminds me of Fortnite. The combat itself is fun, and you can customize your active abilities and stack different passive items in each run, though notably, you cannot stack multiple of the same item. In addition to the gameplay itself, I also quite like some of the enemies and their animations in this game, but I have some concerns that I would like to be addressed. For one, they don't seem to be implementing enough variety in this game because the event pool is being reused on each level, and it's not very big to begin with. Also, the game is super easy right now, so it needs more of a challenge in the future. The Unliving is a real-time strategy-like roguelite where you play as a necromancer. You fight through humans and summon up armies of undead from their corpses in order to keep going. I've enjoyed the RTS-like micromanagement in the game, i.e. the unit management, but the game doesn't really scratch that macro-management elements of RTS games. I also encountered some bugs in the demo, and the demo itself was obviously super limited, but I'm super excited to see where this game goes because it has a lot of potential from what I've seen. Deck RX is a unique hybrid of a racing game and a deck builder roguelite. I was really suspicious of how this game would play out, but I think the game actually works fairly well and had an almost board game-like feel to it. It has more depth than I expected in terms of combos and things like that as well. My biggest complaint with the game is actually this game really needs to turn down the screen shake and those effects because they really annoyed me. I'm not usually bothered by things like that. This game was just funded on Kickstarter, so we'll see how it plays out at its full release. Finally, let's talk about Swordcery. This game is an isometric RPG roguelite with a beautiful art style that reminds me of Breath of the Wild. This game already has a lot of weapon variety, a lot of swords, and a Souls-style stamina system that makes it a more deliberate type of combat. I enjoyed my time with this game, but the controls themselves had a learning curve to them that I hadn't fully mastered before I finished the demo. Swordcery definitely has potential, so I'm excited to see what it looks like in a more complete version. Before I highlight my favorites, I'll just quickly say that I actually did play more roguelites this year than the ones that I included in this video. As I mentioned at the start, I don't want to repeat myself from similar videos that I did, but also there are some games I just want to play more before I talk about them. For example, that includes Noita and Ratropolis. Also, I got some of these games I talked about today for free from the developers themselves, so there's a list of all of those in the description down below. So that aside, which of these games are my favorite? If you had to pick one or two to buy, which would I recommend? Overall, this was a good year for roguelites. The genre keeps growing, and more high-quality releases have been coming out. It's hard for me to choose one or two of these games as the best, so I'm going to be a coward and choose the best couple games for different types of roguelites. Ignoring early access games, if you want an action roguelite, check out Curse the Dead Gods for an isometric game that's Soul-style, and check out Gunfire Reborn for an FPS game. If you want a card game roguelite, check out Tainted Grail or Roguebook. And if you want something that's more unique, look into Loop Hero. I also think several of the early access games have a lot of potential, so I'm excited to see how those shape up in the future as well. If you have more game recommendations for me, please send them my way in the comments. I actually own another 20 or so, probably actually more, roguelites that I really want to play, like Inscription for example, but I'm always looking for new games to buy and new games to try. Huge shout out to all of our channel members who help make videos like this one possible. Your support is greatly appreciated. Be sure to check out my roguelite roundup from last year if you haven't already, and thanks for watching.